Good morning, goeiemorgen. Just for the purpose of discussion, the title is Cape of Wars, but we won't be despairing about it. As Alfred E. Newman in Mad magazine in the first cover said, don't panic, despite the election. The three writers that I have in front of me, to my right immediately is Rehana, Rossouw. There are two books of hers available, which will be the part of the discussion. The one is Predator Politics, and the other one is New Times. Those are the two primary books we will be referencing. Further towards my right is Caryn Dolley, and the primary book we will be focusing on is Clash of the Cartels, which is available there, with a second reference being the book before that, and that is To the Wolves. And Mark Shaw, on the other hand, the primary book we will be focusing on is his new book, Breaking the Bombers, and the one before that, Give Us More Guns. I'm sure they cover a diverse fields, but we will be focusing on one central theme, and that ends Don't Panic. All of these books tell a story about subjects, in Rehana's case, Fred Daniel, whom you will hear about, and in the novel, Aliyah, the journalist that you will hear about. In Clash of the Cartels and To the Wolves, you will hear about detectives and intelligence officers in the Western Cape who are embarked on a certain initiative and a way of working and the struggles they faced. And in Mark Shaw, the same is the case with Give Us More Guns and with Breaking the Bombers. And what is significant about these things is that despite what we usually despair about and what we assume is the norm of non-delivery on a lot of the issues they touch, here is an example of people who act as citizens first and make an initiative and suffer the consequences, but still persist with what they're doing. Whether they're working, what is central to all of these books, the terrain of what we call the politics of organized crime. And we shouldn't really separate and talk about corruption as a little thing on its own, as if there's a special We're dealing with organized crime here and the politics of it. So with that, I think in the sequence we're just briefly going to cover, I'm going to read what is probably going to be the central theme throughout all of the books for the writers. And we're going to start with Rehana, who tells the story of Fred Daniel and what Fred Daniel uncovered about our deputy president at the time. But it's more what Fred Daniel says himself, and I quote, "The law requires all South African citizens to blow the whistle on corruption and to take care of the environment. It does, however, take courage to stand up against political corruption, as there are serious risks to career, reputation, and even personal safety for doing so. But if you love your country, this is not a good enough reason to avert your eyes. Keep your mouth shut and suffer no consequences." So Rehana, if we start there, with your one example of Fred Daniel, who stepped out of the norm and decided to do something as a citizen.
So Fred Daniel is a businessman good morning everybody, and thank you for coming.
Sorry.
Let me wake up. A businessman who had a dream to start a conservation and tourism business in Mpumalanga, which would have been valued at several hundreds of millions of rands at the time that he did it. But he came up against Didi Mabuza, who was at that stage Premier of Mpumalanga, who it appears had been the mastermind behind a huge scam involving land claimants to get the land that Fred had bought and checked had no land claimants on it. There was an attempt by the former Deputy President of South Africa to grab the land by coming forward with fake land claimants on a piece of property which had no land claims. Fred estimated at the time that I wrote the book 5 years ago that the damages that resulted in this attempt to grab his land was 1 billion rand. Sol Kerzner had planned to build 2 hotels on his land, 2 one and onlys. The first one and only in South Africa would not have been at the waterfront, it would have been in Mpumalanga on Fred's land. So we're talking about huge opportunities for employment, huge amount of investment coming into Mpumalanga that really needed it. And the entire thing was sabotaged. In fact, in the end, Fred had to flee for his life after several attempts on his life, his wife's life, and at the time, his 11-year-old son as well, who had a gun pointed at him as he came out of school. These things happen. But then there is people like Fred Daniel. Fred had his own money to invest in this project. He wasn't funded by everybody. He's now used that money to take on Didi Mabuza through the courts. He started taking on Didi Mabuza in the mid-90s. He's still busy. He's got a damages claim against the government, saying that this corruption led to financial damage on his part. At the time that he started the court case, they estimated it was 1.2 billion. It's probably now heading towards 2 billion rand. And of course, this is damages, if Fred wins, this is damages that we as taxpayers are going to pay. But he's going to set a precedent in our courts that an individual citizen can come and say, I'm claiming damages from the government. We know Didi Mabuza is never going to jail. We know the police have no appetite to investigate political corruption. So he's a citizen, and he is setting a precedent in the courts. He had to fight for years to get a court to hear his case. When I last spoke to him about 2 weeks ago, he had spent 58 million rand on lawyers so far, of his own money. He has no funding from anybody. There is no funding for people who want to go to courts to fight corruption. There's no funding available, not in South Africa and not outside of South Africa. He's using his own money, money that could have been invested in Mpumalanga to create jobs and to conserve the environment. He'll get the money back again. We will pay. But it's worth paying out of taxpayers' money because he is going to make it possible for all of us to go to court one day to fight corruption. So yes, he's one of the best examples I've ever seen in all the years that I've been looking at corruption in South Africa. Somebody who says, I'm not giving up, I'm not stepping down, you can do what you want to me. I'm going to fight this until my last breath. And he's doing it.
Thank you, Rehana. I'm going to get back to you later. And Caryn, I think you're well known in terms of organized crime and writing on that, and particularly looking at sometimes the duplicity within the intelligence and police community around dealing with organized crime. But I think the way you characterize it is quite important to look at or contextualize it, which is the same throughout the theme thematically. You know, on page 28 of your book, you say, and I quote, about the different police forces and the different groups that had to come together to form the NOMU service. Instead of eventually cooling and settling into unified, homogeneous security services, post-apartheid South Africa's police and intelligence arenas have remained divided and dirty decades into democracy, with some of the country's highest ranking cops being accused and in some cases convicted of crime. So I think that is my cue for you. If one should look at the Malays pointed out by Rehana there and the challenges in policing, I think in your case in terms of all the politics of organized crime and organized in general, it's a suiting point to start, the capacity that has to deal with this problem.
So it's really confusing as a journalist and as a human. It's confusing to deal with this because you actually, when I started out looking into these things, I thought there was good and bad, and now I'm firmly of the belief that it's everything, it's anyone. You don't know who to believe and who to trust. And I think When I was driving here this morning, I heard a headline on the radio that 3 big gang cases are being heard in the Western Cape. The one's Ralph Stanfield, the alleged boss of the firm, or the 28s. The other's Nafiz Murdoch, let's just leave that where that is. And then the other one is Mark Liffman, Jerome Boyson, etc. In each one of these big cases, we have heard allegations or claims that corrupt cops have framed these individuals. Okay? So who do we believe? We tend to believe the police officers. That's who we should believe in, but I leave the question open. Should we believe the police officers? Not that I'm exonerating any suspects, etc. In terms of globally, if we expand that, and I think it's safe to say that each one of the individuals I've just mentioned does have connections to someone who is not in this country, but globally it's even more infuriating because you see drug lords who have confessed to drug lording, and they aren't arrested in South Africa. They're arrested once they've left South Africa years later, or worse, they're arrested like 20 decades later. Like in the case of Vicky Goswami, an Indian drug lord, he, I think in 2018, 2019, was still going on in the US court openly saying we dominated or we tried to dominate South Africa's drug trade. How the hell was he not arrested in South Africa? You can't dominate a country's drug trade without having operatives and agents or whatever henchmen in that country. So, yeah, on the flip side, just very quickly, I think the very good thing about this, the reason I'm allowed to write this, the worst part of any book for me, if it's nonfiction, is the legal read. The point of this book is that most of these people have been arrested. They are currently in court, and the reason the legal read was so easy is because there are court documents, because police have done their jobs. So I think each one of the books you'll see the ability for me to write is made so much easier because there are very good individuals in between that mess, and we may not be able to identify them because the amount of smear covering them, but they are there.
I think, Mark, thank you very much, Caryn. One of the things you do in your book is to contextualize, especially in Breaking the Bonds, the malaise at the time of Pagat, which is, to some of us, if devolved into another organized crime entity or criminal enterprise. But on page 41, you address the issue of governance, which is a perspective that is refreshingly different at a certain level. You say apartheid rule also wrought a longer term and perhaps more worrying trend than the drug mobsters themselves: gang governance. Poor communities on the Cape Flats became susceptible to criminal governance as the apartheid state excluded non-white communities from legitimate forms of state support and security. Politics abhors a vacuum, and the gangs stepped in to fill the governance space. I think one of the important things about the collapse of governance in that period and the malaise it caused is that in that period of confusion, where nobody was in control, even in the security services, your book sketches how people stepped forward and just did things outside of the norm. And they were intelligence operatives who were not part of the usual mold, and what consequences that had. If you could tell us a bit more about that.
Morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak. The book covers this period, let's say 1998 to 2001, 2002, where, at least in my opinion, there was a short but golden period of criminal justice reform here, targeting organized crime. Pagat was one of the roots of that because of this, an urban terror campaign that was, frankly, at the time, an enormous challenge for the state. Hundreds of bombs, but 20 to 30 very big bombs, not very far from here, some of which didn't go off, but really major level explosions and or intended explosions. And the response was really first stuttering, a lot of mistakes, and then this period of reform. to witness protection, to organized crime legislation, to bringing together intelligence operatives, prosecutors, detectives, to a different set of leadership in the system, which was, I think, malaise is a very good word to describe it, this lack of direction, this not knowing what people can do, and I think there's a new malaise setting into the system to some degree now. But that period, that golden period of reform wasn't sustained. And the beginning of the breakdown of that was in the early 2000s for a variety of reasons, culminating in the mid-2007, 2008. If that reform had continued, in my view, I think the picture of organized crime would look very, very different in Cape Town and in South Africa as a whole. So it seemed to me to be a very important period to capture. Those investigations happened to be against Pagad, but equally the same skills, approaches would be required against the evolving form of organized crime which we face today. And while I welcome the prosecution of the individuals that Caryn has mentioned, it's pretty late also. The evolution, the changing of leadership in organized crime, the changing of criminal markets has had a profound consequence for this city and for the country.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, but I think what we probably should explore in further discussions into that there were Fred Daniels in each of these situations. What is interesting is what happened to those Fred Daniels. What happened to those intelligence officers? And the fact that probably most of them are not around anymore, were hounded out of the system. But more importantly, like Fred Daniels, that I think if we could get a bit more background. We're not asking you to reveal your sources on that side. But like Fred Daniels, it's people who are still continuing a fight, wherever they are, because they love their country. So one of the parts I would like you to reflect on is the state, the welfare of your sources, without going into detail about them, and what type of sacrifices it takes, and that it hasn't stopped them. But I think together now with your contribution, I'm very interested in the fact that you wrote these books, all of you. Yeah, I'm interested, sorry. It's die hartpraterij, maar dan gaat je ons af. But anyway, I'm quite interested in how these individuals impacted on systemic change, particularly with your initiative. I mean, it is clear from your book, that is a clear suggestion, this is where the Scorpions was born, in that particular approach. But in terms of yourselves as an individual, intelligence officers don't talk easily. And detectives who are part of a certain mindset, like even I was, we don't talk easily about it. I find it very significant that you were able to write those books with that kind of access, not only of the intelligence community, but also of, in your case, people who planted bombs. In your particular case, big gangsters who were also probably on trial without going into names, but you were able to deal with that. And that as a journalist, you were directly engaged by those who produce the threat and those who manage it sometimes in corrupt ways. If we could start, I think, let's start with Rehana to reflect on it. We're just going to go down the sequence around that scene. But I'm also interested in your own role as writers and how you were able to bring these products to us in the way you did.
I think the problem in South Africa, and I think it's a problem that's growing worldwide, is that we're all becoming too insular. We are all thinking that our problem is the biggest problem in the world, and we're all thinking that we're unique and that it's different, and that these challenges are only our challenges. Nothing can be done. Personally, I got a phone call last week from a friend who said that she had a house available in Mexico City for 2 weeks, and she's inviting people to come for brief periods of time. Would I like to come for 5 days? And I was like, no, Mexico City is dangerous. Why would I go to Mexico City? I mean, who goes there for a holiday? And I'm retired, but I still think like a journalist. Why would I go to Mexico City? It's like, you know, I might as well go to Gaza, I said to her. And she was like, she didn't understand what I was talking about. And I said, you've heard of the term narco state. And she hadn't, which is why she can go on holiday to a place like Mexico. You know, our problems are big. Our problems are difficult. Our problems are hard. Our levels of assassination is quite low compared to a lot of other places. You know, our journalists are not working in the kind of environment that journalists in Gaza are working in, that journalists in Mexico are working in. Journalists are assassinated. There's a journalist assassinated in Mexico, I think, at least every week. And as many die, others step forward to continue the work. I don't know of any place in the world where there have been problems of gangsterism, where there have been problems of political corruption, which is gangsterism, actually, because, you know, political corruption comes from people who take money from under the table, from people who don't want to operate in the legal environment. So we have political gangsters in South Africa. We're going to have more after May, sitting in Parliament. But we're not the only country in the world facing this. You know, when you read, if you'd please buy Mark's book, because the first people who saw the opportunity in the new South Africa were people who were smuggling cocaine, not people who wanted to invest in gold mines or people who wanted to invest in copper or people who want to invest in coal. It was people who wanted to invest in drugs. I mean, we all saw it. I gave Pagad a list of drug dealers when Pagad first launched. I knew where the crack houses were because crack houses was a new thing. Crack came. Mandrax was difficult, but okay. Before other investors came to South Africa, people investing in our drug economy saw a huge opportunity and they came. These are people who are operating global businesses. These are people who are operating huge businesses. They're not Mark Zuckerberg, they're not Elon Musk, but they are rolling in money and they don't pay tax like other billionaires. So, you know, I think in South Africa we need to stop thinking that we are unique and we are different. We are part of a global experience right now. And maybe if we worked with other people, we might be able to fight these battles much more efficiently.
Cool. In terms of, I said cool like she just didn't say some huge explosive thing. Sorry, that was a lot to take in your. Not yet, yeah. But that will be a follow-up to Clash of the Cartels if it happens. Be careful, I'm teasing. Yeah, I wanted to go into contacts and sources and intelligence agents and who says what. As a journalist at the moment, like I said earlier, I increasingly find it difficult to figure out who is actually on what side. And I'm fully aware that allegiances can be switched and whatnot. And I think in my first book, I actually said it's very difficult because in the underworld, the good is portrayed as the bad, and the bad is portrayed as the good. So you never actually know who you're looking at. But I think the proof of who is doing what is perhaps what we're seeing playing out on the ground. And I think at this point we must mention Lieutenant Colonel Charles Kinnear, who was investigating firearm channels, and Mark's book, Give Us More Guns, goes into a lot of that. And yeah, there are people that are literally risking their lives daily, their families' lives. And it's always horrible because you're seeing the people they're putting in custody, you often see them released again. So it's almost like a sick loop. And I think, General, your life has also been at risk.
I'm not the subject.
No, not at all. But, I mean, we have to acknowledge that it's... I can't not... General Jeremy. But, yeah. So, yeah, and it's... As I said, it's very difficult to figure out who is who in this zoo. I think a lot of what I'm seeing in retrospect are called proxy wars. We're seeing these figures in custody at the moment, but who's actually controlling them? And that's something that, I mean, I can't answer. I wish I knew. But, yeah, it's just a pity that some people have to callously die, and the state's like, oh, well, yeah, it says a lot.
So, Mark, why are we back at this village? Sorry, I keep forgetting. You see this thing of being a general in the police, You believe your authority carries automatically, no matter how soft you think. Why are we backing this Malays?
That's two questions, Jeremy. So I'm going to try the first one very quickly on sources. Just a couple of points. I think it's easier to write history in inverted commas, because it's 20, 25 years ago, and people are more eager to talk. And as I think we were discussing yesterday, I'm working on something in Mandrax in the 1970s, and goodness, everybody wants to talk, right? People will talk because it's a long way back, and so I think the passing of time helps a lot. I think a disillusionment with the current system helps a lot. I think competition between different parts of criminal groups and Pagad helps a lot. People want to talk about the other side, how good they are. I have to say, from working in Cape Town over the years, you really get an unease working all the time, speaking to people. It's a kind of roller coaster ride. You speak to one set and you sort of walk with your back to the wall. You don't really know. You speak to the next set. And in the end, you kind of filter it all out to try and tell what you, and it's very personal, I think, in this process of writing nonfiction, of what you think is the truth. And I should add that who you speak to really counts to the story of the book. And this is a little bit of a personal call. If you're an intelligence operative in this room, you should speak to us because that often achieves balance in the story. Sources are important, and in the end, you write with what you have, and you create a story based on the sourcing that you have. Why the current malaise? I think a lot of reasons, honestly, and I can go through them, but they are really, really intertwined. First is a lack of strategic direction and response to serious and organized crime. And that's for a variety of reasons, including how the police are managed and controlled, including politically. This confusion between what a minister should do, what a national commissioner should do. Splits and competition within the police, between the Hawks and an organized crime division, with the NPA. So this fragmentation. Frankly, the problem is also political. I mean, not frankly, everybody knows that. So the mix of that, corruption across the system. And as my colleagues have said, within that, there are still people working. They don't trust people necessarily even in the next office, is my experience. They are eager sometimes to talk to outsiders because that's a release, and they know these stories are important. And for me, and I'm not saying what I believe very much in the process of telling the narrative of what happened, and I think that's what we are trying to do, is to make sure that there's a story out there that is the truth, that does hold people historically to account in some ways to what happened. So I think the malaise somehow comes from that, and we are due in the area of policing and security for some renewal, I would argue.
Okay. Thank you. The last is questions about yourself. You are being sued for, what, 20 million? You have been the subject of gangsters phoning you in the middle of the night. And you have written some books too that, it is on, you have written some material and engaged people who you cannot trust much beyond after they've said what they said. And I think that is what we want to focus on. How do you deal with it? I mean, how does society support you after you've risked your lives to produce this material that is in front of us? And why the malaise, if you two could also address that particular question first?
Society doesn't support you, which is fine. Society doesn't support journalism. People don't read, people don't buy media, people are quite happy for journalism to die in South Africa the way journalism is dying all over the world. People are happy in their ignorance. They want to believe whatever they saw on TikTok. They want to believe whatever they saw on Instagram and Facebook. Journalism is dying. We get no support from anybody. Yes, I am being sued for 20 million rand. There is not 1 cent available to help me with my legal case in South Africa. Not 1 cent. There is no money available to support journalists who write the truth in this country. I can get money from Sweden. The money's there. I haven't applied for it yet, so if the matter is ever enrolled in court, and I don't think it will be enrolled because lawyers read my book also before they published, it will never be enrolled, but if I ever need to go to court to defend myself, I will go to Sweden for money, and that's sad. People don't support media in South Africa. They are happy for it to die, so I don't know, people want to wallow around in their ignorance and then bad things happen to them. And then one day there's going to be nobody there who's going to be a truth teller and everybody's going to be on their own and nothing will happen. I also want to say that, you know, Fred, he is a millionaire in his own right. He had millions of rands to invest in Mpumalanga. He's now using the money to take the government to court. I admire him, but more than how much I admire him, I admire the mothers of Hanover Park and Manenberg who are taking the government to court because their children were shot and killed by gangsters. Those are the people who need our support. Journalists actually have a little bit of support from their employers and from their lawyers, and we don't get assassinated, like I said, touch wood. The way journalists in South America get assassinated when they investigate gangsters and drug dealers and people like that. So there is very little support, but I think more than us, we are professionals. We know what the risks are. We choose to take those risks. I think the people who really need our support are those mothers in Hanover Park and Manenberg.
Yeah, I think I should have answered this earlier, but when it comes to sources and individuals talking, not necessarily sources, but people who want to talk to journalists, we mustn't forget a huge thing and literally huge ego. Some people want to be heard. Some people want to be in whatever publication for whatever twisted, warped reasons they have, and that also feeds into the sort of TikTok generation, etc. Some people may think it's cool to look all, I don't want to say badass, but badass. So yeah, and then in terms of why, for me as a journalist, I was just naively, I was so naive. I genuinely thought there's a start and there's an end, and there are bad people, and then bad things will happen to those bad people because they've done bad, and that's why I can't stop, because that's just not fair. We need to highlight what is happening, and what you're saying is so important. We need to highlight this, so that's where the focus can be, not on us as journalists and not necessarily on the bad guys. We want to expose bad people. The focus should be on the people that need assistance to get out of situations they haven't conjured or concocted themselves. # Group Areas Act. So yeah, I would, sorry. But yeah, in terms of journalists and support, let's be real. The focus should, I'm sitting here with a microphone in my hand, so the irony is not lost on me, but the focus should be on me. I'm regurgitating information. I'm regurgitating it with a bit of flair. That's it. The focus should be on helping those people who are passing on the information.
Thank you very much, the three of you. I've deliberately left a long time open for questioning. So, to the audience, out to you. Don't panic. Yes. Over there. Let's pass one, keep one of these mics in circulation. Do you have a mic? Okay.
The question I have is this. While the investigative journalists...
Sorry, can you just introduce yourself?
I'm Lionel Lowe. Unearth a lot of information. How much or how can that information be turned into evidence that can stand up in court? Because I get the impression sometimes, while there's a lot of information available, getting it into court in a way that the court can deal with it is problematic.
I think all three, if you can make an attempt to answer it, in particular Mark, because yours reflected your book, a fight between detectives who think in a certain way and intelligence officers who operate on a totally different way. So maybe we should start with Mark as to reflect on the issue.
First to say, I don't think it's the role of journalists and researchers to provide evidence for court. I think this is the first statement to make. The role of journalists and researchers is to expose, to tell a narrative, to raise the public profile, so that the criminal justice system can act. And I direct a very large global organization now, and this is a very key issue for us because a lot around the world, including in Mexico, journalists do expose, and there's a relationship which is very, very complicated between people like us and the state. The state would like sometimes to recruit us. The state would like to be fed information. The state doesn't want to be criticized. So it's this very fine balance in the conversation that we have, I would say, with state entities. Absolutely key. If I could just make 2 points about the difference in role. It's very important, I think, when people are not being held to be held account or being held account, that the journalistic and research, or let's say non-fiction narratives, hold people to account. And in most societies, including ours, in particular in democracies, mentioning people, telling what they have done in the criminal sense is a very powerful tool of holding people to account. And what happens? Your bank may be cut because it's not, your bank account may be cut. It's not only good readers like you reading the book. Secondary banks read the book. There are units that look for names as they emerge from journalistic cover. When you travel, your name enters into international databases, etc., etc. So don't discount what goes into the public domain and then what is used by wider and let's say, more powerful state entities. And I think this is the important role of what we do. I think it's very, very important, and I tell our researchers they are not police officers or police investigators. I think the danger of young folk in the sector is that they think they're an intelligence officer, and it's the first big mistake they make. They are independent, objective observers telling or trying to get at the truth to tell a public story, because publicity, shining a light on these problems, is one of the most powerful disinfectants we have.
Okay, thank you. I think what I thought you would touch on, is this mic on? Yes, I thought you would touch on the one particular case where journalists were attacked in this period in your book is around Rashid Staghi's death. Yeah. Where Benny Gool, it was one of the first challenges faced, where Benny Gool, for example, they wanted to summons him, and General Knipe said we must arrest him at some point in time and just question him quickly. Whereas, incidentally, some of us who were intelligence officers at the time were saying for our own reasons. I was one of them. No, don't arrest Benny Gool. How are we going to access the material covertly that he has? Because he's got a lot of material. Now you arrest and exposes him, and then he can't go to packet scenes again. So we had a different way of looking at it from our own particular perspectives. But yes, in that book, in particular, it reflects a period when the first great challenge towards the press, and a very aggressive one, was made on the detective side. Caryn?
Yeah, I fully agree that, I mean, I haven't written, and I don't think journalists write to create evidence for a court case. It's literally to try and force the state to do something that they already know is wrong. So they know it, it's just highlighting the fact that they know it. And yeah, I mean, personally, I think I would just weep on a witness stand. I'd be terrified. Yeah.
And no one would speak to you again.
Exactly. And yeah, I must say, as I've got older, and as crime has evolved in a very weird way, I can feel the pressure has definitely increased to keep people safe.
I think also on the issue of evidence, this book is very thin. This book is 1/10 of what I know about Didi Mabuza. Since it was published especially, I get phone calls all the time from people who tell me, let me tell you what Didi Mabuza's up to. I know what Didi Mabuza's up to. I know what Didi Mabuza's up to since he left. Where was he? Union Buildings? Where was he? Where did he have an office? Since he left that office that he probably never went to. There are a lot of people who talk. There's a lot of people who give you information all the time. There's a lot of people who want to give you information. And like Caryn said, they don't want to put their name to it. They want your name to go out with that information. And then you're the one who has to carry the can. So, you know, we're not collectors of evidence. I could write, in my entire career, I could always write much more than the story that was published. I just couldn't prove more, although I knew. I couldn't do the kind of reporting, especially before apartheid ended, the kind of reporting that would pass police censors and government censors. I don't know if people remember, but newspapers used to appear with like black lines through stories because we knew what was happening. We weren't allowed to publish it. So my entire career. And I think also the other thing about all of us, and I don't think we should whip ourselves about not being all of us Fred Danielses. We all need to survive, we need to thrive. If we have children and grandchildren, we want to believe that the world is going to become a better place. We can't all live with the hardship that researchers and journalists live with. I wouldn't recommend such a life to anybody, to ordinary citizens. Yes, I salute the mothers who are going to court with a class action lawsuit to take on the police who didn't do enough to stop guns from getting to gangsters in places like Hanover Park and Manenberg. But you can't live with grief every day. That's just human. I don't expect everybody to get up every morning and fight the government. It's not a healthy way to live. So I don't think we should beat ourselves up for not standing up and doing something. We need to survive. A thing that I think about a lot now that there's another election approaching and Thabo Mbeki is walking around as the person who's going to save South Africa. 800,000 people died in this country. Can we please remember them? 800,000 people who could have got medication to save their lives died. But we can't live with that every day because it's hard. It's hard to get up every morning and think about death and bombs and, you know, you can't do it. It's not possible.
Thank you. Can we take another round of quite a few questions? The gentleman in front here.
Thanks. Thanks. My name is Gulam, a retired civil servant. The question I have, it's to Mark Shaw, actually. Two questions. One is, did they succeed against Pagad? We talk about that golden age, because Pagad was a kind of smaller enemy. They were not part of a global drug cartel. So it was like, in a sense, a much easier victim. And there was political unity at the time, because Western Cape government, or premier at the time, was also coming from a Muslim background and thought Pagad was, in a sense, creating instability. So that's the first. The second, you talk about the golden period. Are there lessons around how the criminal justice system can be organized, and who takes responsibility for coordination so you can have an effective criminal justice system? Thanks.
Can we just take more questions? Over there, on to the right.
Good morning, I'm Brahm. I've been 13 years in my younger days with the SABC in Joburg. Maybe a bit of information on Didi Mabuza, if possible. Not quite, it's not that prominent to me. And the other thing is, I'm no expert on it. I'm just talking about what I've heard and what I've dealt with. The gang situation, especially in specific areas, is obviously, you've got innocent people dying, you've got innocent children dying. So I think it's a much more serious thing than people realize. And it's wonderful to hear that there are such courageous mothers. 100% vir hulle. I get the idea the only way that a gang can basically really be taken out is by an independent source. I tell you why. Of what I've heard and what I've seen, there's always somebody's family involved, or a brother or sister, or
Sorry, sir,
somebody
can we get to
knows
the
somebody.
question? To the question.
I'm gonna end now. And the other thing is, I believe they paid under the table, and then can carry on with the business. So if you can maybe elaborate a bit on that, you experts. Lovely to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank
Keep
you.
up the good work.
Thank you. Can we take another? Yeah, behind there.
Hi, good morning. I'm Fatima Shabuddin. Thank you for a really fascinating conversation. I've been around the rooms at the fairs now for the few past days, and what struck me is that there's parallel conversations happening. There's an economic conversation, there's the politics, there's corruption, and it's very difficult to see the connections between the two. So when I listen to you, Rehana, talking about that there's a moment of globalization where what's happening to us is not unique, no? That it's not a coincidence that our crimes, pattern crimes, mirror that of Brazil and India. That's also extremely unequal. I'm thinking, as someone who's an activist in civil society, what is it that we're fighting for as the solution? If the issues are institutional and systemic, what is the link between this and the fact that we are the most unequal country in the world, and that there's a predatory economic system, that we talk about corruption and niemand praat van capitalism and dieselfde asem. No? There's a particular economic model that is resulting in all of this. So I'd like you to reflect on the issues you've talked about and the economic model that prevails in our country. Thanks.
Okay, we'll take another round after the responses to those questions. Mark, let's kick off with the first question, and the rest is between the two of you to answer.
Thanks for the question, which is an excellent one. Very briefly, Pagad was a very sophisticated and serious challenge to the state. And one of the reasons for that was that it rose without, it's recounted in the book, without a clear analysis in the state as to what it was. It operated in cell structures with very, very committed and ideological members and a hardcore group of people that did it. Was it the same as taxi violence or other forms of organized crime? No. But I would say that it was one of the most important threats to the new state. So the response to it and how it evolved is important for analysis. And the response and the lessons from that can be applied to other challenges we have, hence the book, Gulam. What to do now, I think the question on inequality strikes me as a very important one, I have to say. First point is that we are very much like Latin America in our crime levels. Why is that? Because we have a lot of illicit markets and high levels of inequality. The people being arrested generally are those that are excluded and outside of the system. The criminal bosses, whatever you want to call them, generally for lots of reasons, good lawyers, money, corruption, barely see the inside of a cell. What do we need to reduce, for example, the number of homicides here in Cape Town? And as I understand it, there were some 90 last week. I don't have the exact number, of which a large proportion were gang-related. It barely makes the press, if it makes the press at all. That's not blaming the press. That's a separate issue, but it's the scale of the problem is phenomenal. Central American levels. Just to say that Mexico has a lower homicide rate than South Africa. So in fact, going to Mexico City is quite a good choice for not for journalists, of course, but I think you're not going there to report on. So I think that we should put in context the scale of our challenge. What we need to do, in my view now, and perhaps, just perhaps this is the time, the issues of the economy, inequality, have to be responded to. It's not my area, so I will leave it there for others. On the law enforcement front, I think we need, to be very frank, highly skilled, well-resourced, independent investigative body, call it whatever you want, which is free of political influence and has the capacity to conduct investigations and go after the criminal economy in South Africa. Short of that, we will always compromise around this. And that's what we have now, a fragmented set of bodies. Yes, there will be some successes, but there will be this ongoing symbiosis between the state and the criminal economy and the meshing between them, the greys that Caryn talks about. So it can be done, but I think it needs a set of political conditions and the resourcing and commitment to be able to make it happen. I would say that's what the solution should be.
So, yeah, at the moment in the Western Cape, I think over 24 hours we average between 12, 13, sometimes 21 murders. And I know the one day, recently it was 31 within 24 hours. We did report on it. And I must say what Mark says is correct, because it's very difficult to keep thinking of innovative ways to shock people into action or doing something or caring. And the other thing is, how do you eliminate a gang? I think we mustn't view gangsters in that archaic way of seeing these men with low-slung pants and stuff. That's an idea that was pushed onto us. A gang, a criminal gang, includes the people who are enforcing laws that enable gangs to proliferate. It includes the police officers who are smuggling firearms. It includes that restaurant being run over there, which is a known alleged gang bosses. So it trickles into every aspect of society. So I don't think we should think, oh, how do we eliminate the gang? We need police officers to do this. The police are part of the problem. A gang is a microcosm of society. So it needs a lot more. And like, this sounds so weak, but decency. It needs to start in a basic way that everyone can grasp. And I think that's just lacking.
Rehana?
I don't know where the pessimism comes from. All of us in this room, every single one of us in this room, survived colonialism, survived a genocide of an indigenous community, survived slavery, survived apartheid. We're still standing, every single one of us. And I really do mean white people are also survivors of apartheid. So where does this fear come from? 30 years ago, almost to the day, we overthrew apartheid. We slayed a big dragon. Apartheid was huge. Apartheid had international support from the most powerful governments in the world. You look at what the US and the UK are now doing in their support of Israel, and it's exactly what they did in support of the apartheid government. We said no. We stood up. We said enough. And we did it. So, I mean, that was only 30 years ago. Some of us are still alive who did that. Some of us still have our brains working who did that. And we can inspire young people and tell them, we said no, you can say no. On the economic model, also this rubbish about poor people who the only people they follow on TikTok are people who are famous for being famous, and how people make money nowadays because they're just famous and they're on TikTok. Why are they our heroes? Why are our heroes not the people who are fighting crime, the people who are starting community gardens, the people? We can choose to make heroes of those people ourselves before they even get into the newspapers. We can make heroes of them. We don't need to make heroes of, you know, the rubbish celebs who, I don't even know what they do anymore. We can do it. We did it before. We can do it again. I don't know where the pessimism comes from.
Okay, thank you. Next round of questions. At the back there. Gentleman over the way. To the left and then to the right there.
I'm Lorraine. My experience has been that with gangsterism, the impetus won't come from the community because they're not just bad.
Yes.
They also do a lot of good. So I don't know what do we do with that.
Okay.
Can we just take 3? There's another question. It's 1, 2.
Hi, I'm Richard Myberg. I'm curious about how one can possibly divert attention to social media back to journalists. Do you have any ideas how one can possibly strategically go about it.
One more question? Last question. Okay. Nobody, if there's no other question, I would like to ask you a question. I think I know you don't want to make yourself the subject of your own books and put yourself in the story as academics and journalists, but these books are acts of activism. It informs a consciousness about the problem in society in a way that other people couldn't do it with your access. So what I would like to ask, what more can we expect from your pens as writer activists in future after this? And then we'll conclude the session after the questions. So if you could contribute freely, we've got enough time between the three of you to some of the questions, select what you want to answer. But let's end with that crisp little point at the end. Anyone can start.
I just want to go on to that, the last question, because I think that is a very important one. The gangsters are role models. They are the businessmen in the community. They're the guys. My first novel tried to explore why young men in the townships are drawn to gangsterism, and they are, because the gangsters are the role models. First they get the girls. Well, first they got the money. They get every woman they want. They drive a BMW. You know what I mean? They are the role models. I mean, apartheid did not create an environment for black people to be successful business people. So the only successful business people young people saw often were the gangsters. So they are businessmen. If we start seeing them as businessmen also, then we can start tackling the problem. So they are role models. We need to do something, like I say, can we create new heroes? We don't need to follow these people. Yeah.
What can we expect from you, Rehana? As an activist, a writer activist, what's the next?
Put pressure on me. I'm trying to be positive. I'm trying. I am busy writing, and I am trying to be positive, and I think I'm succeeding. So expect happiness, joy, and anti-capitalist writing in my next novel.
Thank you. Caryn?
In terms of social media and journalists, etc., like all of us have Twitter or X handles and whatnot. Our Daily Maverick, where I work, I feel like I'm punting them, but anyway, they have social media channels on TikTok, etc. So we are told to share each other's work. It becomes a bit difficult because then horrible people comment horrible things and make awful remarks. So if other people could do it, please do that. That would be useful, yeah. And then what to expect? I think within the next hour you'll see a piece on Daily Maverick about an arrest. And long term, I don't even have time to have breakfast in the morning, so long term is parked at the moment.
Thank you. Mark?
I just wanted to respond to the very good question about gangs providing services. I think this is a key strategy to achieve legitimacy in communities, and we need to see it like that. And a lot of the response to gangs and organized crime is symbolic. It's about owning spaces. It's about running theater groups in places occupied by gangs. And that's just one example. It really benefits us to think about the symbolic struggle against the ownership by criminal figures. What do? I am running a global organization. Sadly, I don't live in South Africa anymore. My hair is gray because I spend a lot of time trying to raise money to make sure that people are paid in the organization. But we are supporting over 200 civil society groups around the world, including the Mothers of the Disappeared in Mexico. Just to give an example, a group of mothers, their children have been disappeared by cartels. They look for the remains, etc. And I think that civil society responds to, let's call it malfeasance or the illicit, generated in particular ways by the nature of the economy, exclusion, the way that law enforcement operates. And remember, law enforcement was created as a mechanism, created by citizens, as a mechanism to respond, to provide service to communities. And we ourselves should design and respond and have and ensure accountability to how those institutions operate. And it's often in the breach that occurs. And our little contribution, I think, is to create the narrative rather naively, perhaps, of truth, in inverted commas, but of the political economy of the illicit, which is key to our society, but actually every society on the planet.
Thank you very much to our writers. Yeah, these books, all of them are available at the back. The book that the first novel Rehana was referring is What Will People Say? It's the one before other novel, New Times in particular. All of them are available at the back from Wordsworth. With that, thank you very much to you at the audience, and thank you to our guests. Thank you.
Thank you.